Welcome to Scholar Sauce. Today we're going to talk about whether we vote the right way. In the United States, the most common election method is called plurality and uses a single choice ballot where everybody can just pick their favorite candidate. But is this voting method actually any good? That is, does it actually represent what the people want? In other places in the US, people are experimenting with an alternative voting method called ranked choice voting, which is supposed to improve on plurality. But is this voting method better? Does it represent what the people want? In this video, we're going to explore these ideas a bit. To start though, let's do a little thought experiment. I'm going to present you with 4 mock elections, and after the description of each election, I'm going to ask you who you think should win that election. And I want you to pause the video, think about it, and write your answers down in the comments. Be sure to comment before you hit play at the end of the 4 elections and we discuss the results. The first election is between 3 candidates, Dwight, Jim, and Andy. For this election, voters were asked to compare head-to-head matchups and pick a preferred candidate between each possible pair. The first pair of candidates were Dwight and Jim, and 33% of the voters picked Dwight, while 67% picked Jim. The second pair were Dwight and Andy. Here, 51% of the voters picked Dwight, while 49% picked Andy. And in the final pair between Jim and Andy, 55% picked Jim, while 45% picked Andy. So, who do you think should win this election? And I'll give you a second or two to answer, but go ahead and pause the video if you want more time. Before going on to the next election, I recently gave this presentation to a live audience in the math department at Weber State University. There were about 17 people in attendance, and here's who they thought should win this election. we're going to vote on who won the voting, right? So it's kind of meta. How many of you guys think that Jim won this election? And what do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So we got 17 for that. How many think Dwight did? Nobody. How many think Andy did? Okay. Somebody tell me why you think John won the election. Yeah, go ahead.
The audience member said it was because he won the first and third election.
Yeah. In fact, he's not even in the other one, right? So every runoff that he's in, he won. In the second election, we again have 3 candidates, Ronnie, Donnie, and Johnny. Here, we just had the voters pick one candidate, and whoever gets the largest number of votes is the winner. Ronnie got 30% of the vote, while Donnie received 31% of the vote, and Johnny got 39% of the vote. Who do you think should win this election? Go ahead and pause if you need a little more time to decide. Before going on, here's what those same folks at Weber State thought. So take a look at that. How many of you guys think that Ronnie won this election? How many of you think that Donnie should win this election? And how many of you think that Johnny should win this election? I'm assuming that that's 17 total people again. So, okay, we'll say 17, 0, and 0. Okay, for the third election, we have 3 candidates, Frankie, Abby, and Teddy. In this election, we have 600 voters. We asked all the voters to rank the 3 candidates from their favorite to least favorite. And in the rankings, we find that 186 of them listed Teddy first, 234 listed Abby first, and 180 listed Frank first. Since no candidate has a majority of first place votes, we decide to remove the candidate that has the least number of first place votes. That's Frankie. After removing Frankie from the election, we look at the rankings of those that submitted Frankie first and find that 120 of them have listed Teddy second, while 60 of them listed Abby second. To take those voters' opinions into account, we decide to count those votes for Teddy and Abby respectively. This leaves Teddy with 306 votes and Abby with 294 votes. Now, who do you think should win this election? And take a second, but feel free to pause the video if you need more time. Here's what they thought at Weber. How many of you guys think that Frankie should win this election? Okay. How many of you think that Teddy should win it? Okay. We've got, this time it's not unanimous. 1, 2, 3, well, let's do the back row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, it looks like. How many of you think Abby should win this election? Okay, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Did somebody not vote? Or did I not count somebody? Okay. That's okay. You can abstain. The last election is between Cal, Joe, and Tom. For this election, we asked the voters again to rank the candidates from their favorite to least favorite. And the table here was the result. In each column, the top name listed is the favorite candidate, while the bottom name is the least favorite candidate. The percentage in each column is the percentage of the population that listed the candidates in that order. Take a look at the table and decide who you think should win the election. Take a few moments here. In this case, I recommend pausing the video and really thinking about it. Finally, here's what everyone thought at Weber State. How many of you guys think Tom should win this election? So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for Tom. So how many said Joe? We got 1, 2, 3, 4. How many of you think Cal should win this election? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We got one less that time too. Did anybody not vote? You didn't vote. Put you down for Cal. Okay. Any other? That's only 16 of us. Anybody else? I think I had 17 at one point. Let's ask about this one here. I'm curious. Those that voted Tom, why did you vote for Tom? Why do you think? Sorry, I should say it again. Why do you think Tom should win this election? That's the way I should phrase that. Yeah, go ahead.
The audience member said that Tom got pretty close to Cal in top votes and had a lot of second votes.
Yeah, in fact, it looks like for Tom's second choice votes, it's 62% voted Tom second. 30% voted him top. Only 8% voted him third. Okay. How about Joe? How many those that think Joe should win this election? Why? What do you guys think?
He said that he voted for him just for the fun of it.
Just for the fun of it? Okay. Okay. How about Cal? Those that voted for Cal. Yeah, go ahead.
The audience member said that she looked at the first rank for all of them and Cal's percentage of first place votes was higher.
Okay. I respect that. I think that's interesting. I will note Cal he has 39%, which is the most first place. Cal's second place is 16%, and 45% of the populace voted Cal last, which I think is actually the largest amount of voting last. No, Joe is actually voted last most, 47%. It's interesting that for the first two elections, the group at Weber State were unanimous in who they thought should win the election, but that the answers were more varied when the election results were presented, as in the third and fourth election. This is even more interesting when I tell you that all 4 elections were actually the same election. That's right, all 4 elections were calculated off the table given in the 4th election. The labels of the candidates were the only thing that I changed. And this is how the candidate labels lined up. Jim, Ronnie, Frankie, and Tom were all the same candidate. Dwight, Donnie, Teddy, and Joe were all the same candidate. And Andy, Johnny, Abby, and Cal were all the same candidate. Now take a quick look at who you selected for each election and compare them to the labels here. Did you always select the same candidate to win? If not, then why do you think there was a difference? Let's check out some interesting observations from the group at Weber. For election A, they unanimously indicated that Jim should win, and the most common reason was because he won both head-to-head matchups that he was in. However, for election B, they unanimously said that Johnny should win, but Johnny is the same candidate as Andy, who loses both head-to-head matchups they're in. And in election C, the largest portion of people indicated that Teddy should win, but this candidate was Dwight in the first election, who won a matchup and lost a matchup. And in election D, the group was much more evenly split. This is interesting because it suggests that who we think should win an election is dependent upon how the results are presented to us. This might also mean that our intuition is not great, and we need some guiding principles to help us decide what voting method is best. We should start with discussing the purpose of voting for an elected position. The purpose of voting is to accurately determine the collective opinion of the people about which candidate is preferred. To do this, we have to do 2 things. First, we need an election method that can accurately identify the candidate that most reasonably reflects the collective opinion of the people, assuming that the people communicate honestly about their opinions of who they individually desire to be elected. We also need the public to vote honestly. If the public does not accurately represent their own individual preferences, then there's no possible way for an election method to accurately identify the collective preference. Then, when we are selecting an election method to use, we need one that not only can identify the most reasonable collective choice, but that also incentivizes the public to vote honestly and disincentivizes what's called strategic voting. Strategic voting happens when a voter decides to misrepresent their actual preference because they believe that a more preferable outcome would occur if they did so than compared to the outcome of them voting honestly. For example, plurality voting is particularly bad at incentivizing people to vote honestly. Have you ever heard of the notion of voting between the lesser of two evils, or that voting for a third-party candidate is throwing your vote away? Voters avoiding voting for their actual preference to instead vote for their favored candidate that actually has a likelihood of winning is a form of strategic voting. And a lot, if not most of the voters in a plurality system vote this way. From that alone, it seems pretty hard to believe that the traditional voting method of plurality actually has a chance at achieving the purpose of voting. So how do we determine if there's a voting method that works better than plurality at achieving the purpose of voting? Well, a principle from game theory might be useful here. Namely, that the rules of a game is what determines the optimal strategy. Take basketball, for example. The ABA started in 1967, and one of the things that it did differently than the NBA was that it introduced the three-point line to the league. Prior to this in the NBA, all baskets counted as 2 points, which incentivized players to play close to the basket where the chances of making a shot were highest. Well, the ABA was looking for something that would set it apart from the NBA and get fans more excited to watch their games, and the three-point line was it. This forced teams to play differently. Now teams could have players that were effective at this higher value shot, which in turn forced teams to learn how to defend against it. Playing changed, coaching changed, and the game got more interesting. While initially resisted by the NBA after the NBA and the ABA merged in 1976, the NBA adopted the three-point line just 3 years later in 1979, with the NCAA and high schools adopting it in 1986 and 1987 respectively. And that shot is still changing the game today. Now, a whole generation later, we have players in the NBA who grew up watching the three-point basket and spending their time learning how to be great at it. And now practically no team exists in the league without elite three-point shooters playing, and some of the best players are ones like Steph Curry who can pretty much sink a shot from anywhere on the court. And sports leagues continue to do this sort of thing all the time. The rules of practically every professional sport are changed every year in order to incentivize or disincentivize various behaviors. Most video games with heavy multiplayer communities issue balance patches regularly in order to change the incentives in the game. In both cases, these changes are usually to make the games more competitive, but sometimes it's to make them more entertaining too. What's important to our discussion about voting is that the rule change to include the three-point line is what changed the player's behavior over time. And in determining a good voting method, we need to investigate what behaviors the rules of a voting system incentivizes and evaluate whether that helps us achieve the purpose of voting. Let's take a closer look at voting methods. Now, each voting method actually has two parts to it: a voter opinion data collection method, called a ballot, and a voter opinion data interpretation method. Let's first take a look at the various kinds of ballots that can be used to collect voter opinion data. Each kind of ballot collects different amounts and different types of data. The first is a single choice ballot. On this ballot, each voter is only allowed to select one candidate and hence can only communicate a single preference. Very few voter opinion data interpretation methods can be used on such a limited amount of data collected about voter opinions. The next ballot is a ranked choice ballot. On this ballot, each voter is asked to rank all the candidates from their favorite to their least favorite. And this kind of ballot collects more data about voters' opinions about their preferences between the various candidates. Another type of ballot is an approval ballot. For this ballot, voters are asked to indicate which candidates that they would approve of in the office. This ballot does not collect any information about the voters' preferences between the candidates that they approve, just whether they approve or not. Finally, a fourth type of ballot is a score ballot. On this ballot, voters are tasked with scoring each candidate on a predetermined scale, say from 0 to 9. This collects a lot of data. A ranking can usually be gleaned from such data, although score voting allows for a voter to submit an equal preference for 2 or more candidates, which a ranked choice ballot would not. Moreover, a score ballot allows for the communication of the strength of a voter's preference between two candidates gauged by the difference between their two scores. Typically, a score ballot is interpreted by selecting as the winner the candidate with the highest average score, and interpreting a score ballot this way is called score voting or range voting. Now let's move on to talk about the more interesting part of this discussion, that of the voter opinion interpretation method. For the sake of brevity, we'll restrict our discussion to just methods that can be computed from a ranked choice ballot. This includes the method of plurality, which can be computed from both a single choice or a ranked choice ballot. To do so from a ranked choice ballot, one simply looks at just the highest preference of each voter, and indeed that's what a few of the participants in my lecture at Weber State did when presented with a complete preference table. We will also discuss the method of instant runoff voting. In the United States, this method is usually referred to as ranked choice voting or RCV, but that's a pretty terrible misnomer because there are a ton of voting methods that use a ranked choice ballot, and each one of them could be correctly referred to as RCV. To avoid confusion, whenever talking about instant runoff voting, people should be clear and either refer to it as instant runoff voting or call it IRV. In fact, we're actually going to talk about two other methods of ranked choice voting. And we'll mention here the Borda count, which uses a ranked choice ballot, but later on we'll also discuss something called ranked pairs. Let's investigate the properties of each of these methods and see how they fare in achieving the purpose of voting. The easiest way to do this is with some example mock elections. So here's a plurality election between four candidates, R, L, I, and D. R obtains 36% of the vote, L gets 9%, I gets 25%, and D gets 30%. Via plurality, we just identify the candidate with the largest number of votes, and plurality indicates that one is the winner. So here, R wins. We can also have computed this for ranked choice ballots. Let's imagine that the electorate provided ranked choice ballots instead of a single choice ones, and the following orders had the given percentages of the electorate vote for them. That is, 16% of the voters indicated that they preferred R first, then L second, I third, and D fourth. 12% indicated that they preferred R first, then I second, L third, and D last, and so on. A complete list of all the electorate's preference orders is called a preference profile. Notice that the number of first choice votes matches what we saw in plurality, and hence we could have just looked at those to compute the plurality winner. But now that we have more data, let's see how else we could interpret this information. Currently, the most popular form of ranked choice voting is the instant runoff method. In this method, we take the preference profile and look at the first choice of all the voters and tally up how many each candidate got. If a candidate has a majority of first choice votes, they're declared the winner. If not, then the candidate with the least number of first choice votes is eliminated from everyone's preference order.
Eliminate them one at a time.
Well, not like that, but yeah. Those voters that indicated the eliminated candidate first now will have their support redistributed to the non-eliminated candidate that they listed next. Then we check again to see if a candidate has a majority of support. And this process repeats until a candidate receives a majority of the votes, which is guaranteed to at least happen once we get down to 2 candidates left. As an example, let's look at the same preference profile from before. Notice that no one has a majority of first choice votes. Then we look for who has the least, which is candidate L, and we eliminate that candidate from every preference list.
It's time to eliminate them.
This yields an updated preference profile, which we have to collect on the same preference orders. Now we check again to see if any candidate has a majority of votes. And since none of them do, we look again for the candidate that has the least number of votes. This time that's I, and we eliminate them.
Must eliminate.
No, stop! That's not what I mean. Anyway, when we remove I from all the preference lists and collect them on the same orders again, we get this updated preference profile. Now we see that R has a majority, and so R wins. Note that in these two examples, plurality and instant runoff agreed on the winner. This does happen a lot of the time actually, but it's not guaranteed. In fact, at the beginning of this video, election C used instant runoff, which would have elected a different candidate than the plurality winner, so they don't always agree. Now let's interpret the preference profile again, this time using another ranked choice voting method called the Borda count. In this method, each candidate gains a certain number of points from each first choice vote they receive, and then a smaller number of points for second choice votes, followed by an even smaller number of points for a third choice vote, and so on. Then the candidate with the largest total points is elected the winner. This is not dissimilar to how a cup in Mario Kart determines the winner. For each race, you get points according to how well you did in the race, and then the player with the most points at the end of the cup wins the cup. Exactly. Using the same preference profile from before as an example, we'll give 3 points to a first choice vote, 2 points for a second choice vote, and so on. Here we see then that R scores 158 points, L scores 102 points, I scores 199 points, and D scores 141 points. This means that I wins via a Borda count. The reason why I gained so many points was due to a reasonably strong first choice showing, but also the strongest second choice showing of any candidate. This is interesting, if only because it produces a different winner than instant runoff.
That was fun. It's like Mario Kart.
See? Told you. Now that's all well and good, but how do we determine which method is best? That is, which of these best satisfies the purpose of voting while incentivizing honest voting? Well, mathematicians, economists, and social scientists have long thought about this problem. And the ways that they have found to approach it is to identify certain properties called fairness criteria that an ideal election method should satisfy. These might try to ensure that an election method identifies the most reasonable collective choice, or it might try to ensure that honest voting is incentivized. There are dozens of fairness criteria that have been proposed, and some are considered more important than others. A few examples of such criteria that are generally considered pretty important are the Condorcet winner and Condorcet loser criteria, the monotonicity criterion, and the independence of irrelevant alternatives or no spoiler candidates criterion. Let's take a deeper dive on each of these criteria. Believe it or not, we've already talked about Condorcet winners and losers in this video without realizing it. Consider election A from our experiment at the beginning of the video. In that election, Jim won every runoff he was in, and a candidate that wins every runoff they're in is called the Condorcet winner. Similarly, a candidate that loses every runoff that they're in is called a Condorcet loser. And in this case, Jim was a Condorcet winner and Andy was a Condorcet loser. One good way to think about this is a round-robin tournament in a sport. If you have a bunch of teams and you want to determine who the best team is, you could have them all play each other. And if a team happens to beat every other team whenever they play, that team's the best team. Similarly, if a team loses to every other team whenever they play, that team's the worst team. Essentially, that's the phenomenon that Condorcet winners and losers are trying to capture. Since the sports team that beats everyone is the best, and the one that loses to everyone is the worst, we can apply the same logic here. The Condorcet winner is the best candidate since they are preferred by the electorate to every other candidate. Similarly, the Condorcet loser is the worst candidate since the electorate prefers every other candidate to them. This suggests a couple of fairness criteria. First, we have the Condorcet winner criterion. This states that if there is a Condorcet winner, the election method has to elect them. On the other hand, the Condorcet loser criterion states that if there is a Condorcet loser, the election method must avoid electing them. In the experiment at the beginning of this video, elections A and B show that plurality voting not only failed to elect the Condorcet winner, but it actually elected the Condorcet loser. So plurality voting fails both of these criteria. Elections A and C show that instant runoff voting failed to elect the Condorcet winner, but avoided electing the Condorcet loser. And indeed, instant runoff fails the Condorcet winner criteria, but does in fact satisfy the Condorcet loser criterion. At this point, one might ask, why not just always select the Condorcet winner and be done with it? Well, the problem is that there isn't always a Condorcet winner. In fact, it's entirely possible for the electorate to fall into a sort of rock, paper, scissors paradox with the candidates. That is, the electorate might prefer candidate A to B, prefer candidate B to C, but prefer candidate C to A.
Fine, let's play rock, paper, scissors for it.
Exactly. Such a cycle of preferences is called a Condorcet paradox. To understand this, let's look at another example. This election here will still be between the four candidates R, L, I, and D, but this time the preference profile is a little different. You can still see what percentage the electorate ordered the candidates each way, though. Let's check to see if there's a Condorcet winner. To do this, we need to do a runoff comparison with each pair of candidates. Fortunately, a preference profile allows us to simulate every such runoff. For example, let's compute the runoff for R and L. To do this, we remove I and D from each preference order.
We could have eliminated them!
Stop it! We're not doing that anymore. Anyway, after removing I and D, we get the updated preference profile here. Then R beats L in a runoff 75% to 25%. Next, we can do the same thing with R and I by removing L and D from the list. And here I beats R 55 to 45. For R and D, we find that D beats R 51 to 49. For L and I, L beats I 65 to 35. For L and D, L beats D 60 to 40. And finally for I and D, D beats I 55 to 45. This yields the following list of runoffs, and this produces two Condorcet cycles. R is preferred to L, who's preferred to I, who's preferred to R. Similarly, R is preferred to L, who's preferred to D, who is also preferred to R. And if there's no Condorcet winner, then there's at least one Condorcet paradox in the electorate's preferences, and indeed here there's no Condorcet winner. Well, is there any hope to emphasize the idea of a Condorcet winner even when there isn't one? It turns out that several more modern methods of ranked choice voting have attempted to answer this very question, and it really comes down to how one resolves Condorcet paradoxes. The method that we'll talk about here that does this is called ranked pairs. In ranked pairs, we take a preference profile and consider each pairwise runoff. If there's a Condorcet winner, then the method elects them. If there isn't, then each pairwise victory is ranked according to the margin of victory, with larger margins ranking higher. The pairwise runoff victories are prioritized according to this ranking. Any Condorcet cycles are resolved by simply rejecting the weakest victory in the cycle. The result is a complete ordering of the candidates. In a single winner election, ranked pairs selects the most preferred candidate from that complete ordering as the winner. For example, in the election we had before, if we rank the runoffs according to margin of victory, we see that the weakest victories in the two cycles are I over R and D over R, respectively. We reject those victories because they have the weakest claim and find a complete ordering of the candidates remains. R is preferred to L, which is preferred to D, which is preferred to I, and hence ranked pairs selects R as the winner. Now one might object here and say, wait a minute, R lost to two of the four candidates, D and I. Why should R win? However, if you get rid of R because of this, you'd have to select L as the winner because L is preferred to both D and I. But then the electorate would say, wow, we really prefer R to L, in fact, more than any other preference. We should get that candidate back. So R is still really the consensus candidate, even if they happen to lose to two of the other candidates head-to-head. And that's really what ranked pairs is trying to capture by prioritizing margin of victory. And this also shows, by the way, that ranked pairs satisfies both the Condorcet winner and the Condorcet loser criteria. But what about other fairness criteria? Well, let's next talk about the monotonicity criterion. This one's really fascinating, but it may seem kind of silly at first. This fairness criterion states that no candidate's chances of winning can be harmed by voters increasing their preference for that candidate. And it might seem odd that this can even happen, but it turns out that several voting methods actually fail this. Instant runoff happens to be one of them. To see how, let's consider an example. Suppose we have an election of 3 candidates, A, B, and C. A few days before the election, suppose the electorate's preferences are given by the preference profile here. No one would actually know this before the election, but just suppose that this represents what the electorate is currently thinking a few days before the election. If the election will run that day, we would see that no one has a majority of first choice support and C has the least, so C is removed from the preference profile, which yields this updated preference list, and A would win. However, as this is a few days before the election, no one knows that A was going to win. A recognizes that B is their biggest rival though, and so spends the remaining days before the election campaigning to the group of B supporters that are sure to list A second. Candidate A convinces a number of such supporters, totaling 3% of the total electorate, to change their preference order from B over A over C to A over B over C. On election day, the voters cast their votes, and the results yield this preference profile. Again, no one has a majority, but this time B has the fewest first choice votes because A took some of them. So B is eliminated then, and their supporters are redistributed, yielding this preference profile. Since more of B's supporters preferred C to A, C ends up winning in this case. This means that due to A's last-minute campaigning that successfully garnered them more support, they caused themselves to lose the election, which is really weird, but shows that instant runoff fails the monotonicity criterion and is susceptible to this problem at least some of the time. Another very important fairness criterion is independence of irrelevant alternatives. This can be stated in a few different ways, but sufficient for our discussion, I'll state it as follows. If an election method determines that candidate A is preferred to candidate B when candidate X is not running, then if candidate X instead runs for the election, then the election method will not determine that candidate B is now preferred to candidate A. In other words, there are no spoiler candidates of any kind. Plurality voting famously fails this criteria as spoiler candidates can easily crop up. For example, if you had an electorate that was 60% Republican and 40% Democrat, if 2 Republicans run, they might split the 60% of their vote in a way that neither gets 40%, which will lead the Democrat to win. But had either one of the Republicans run on their own, they likely would have won handily. Instant runoff also fails this criterion and hence is susceptible to some kinds of spoilers. To see this, consider another example election. First, suppose that 2 candidates run in an election, one from each of the 2 major parties, and the voters vote along party lines. Most voting systems, and certainly instant runoff voting, reduce to majority voting with just 2 candidates. And in this case, 51% of the voters pick B over A, and B wins the election via instant runoff voting. Now suppose that a third candidate, C, enters the mix. None of the voters are going to change their relative ordering of B and A, that is 51% will still rank B over A, and 49% will still rank A over B, but now they have to decide where to place C in their rankings. Suppose also that C is from the same party as B, but is perhaps more extreme overall. This might be desirable to many in that party, and so the majority of that party's voters rank C first, but keep B listed above A. Specifically, 39% of the entire electorate, which is a majority of the 51% that belong to that party, vote C over B over A. A few in the party, specifically 8% of the electorate, prefer the candidate B first, but prefer C to A. And this doesn't change the relative ordering of B and A either. B is still ranked above A. Finally, the most moderate part of B's party finds that C is too extreme for them, and so they instead prefer A to C. They still list B first though, and hence keep B and A in the same relative ordering. Now, when the election is run, no candidate has a majority of first place votes. Instant runoff eliminates the candidate with the fewest first place votes, which in this case is candidate B, who would have won the election before C came in. And when B is eliminated, their supporters are redistributed, giving 4% to candidate A and 8% to candidate C. And this gives candidate A a majority over C, and hence candidate A wins. Most notably, this means that the election method switched the ordering of how it interpreted A and B's preferences from the electorate. That is, before C came into the election, instant runoff indicated that B was preferred to A. But after C joined the election, instant runoff indicated that A was preferred to B, even though no voter changed their relative preference between A and B. Thus, instant runoff's determination of the preference between A and B depended on candidate C. This means that instant runoff fails the independence of irrelevant alternatives criterion. But it's not that surprising, since it turns out that almost all voting methods fail this criterion. And the situation isn't always so simple as the method just fails it or it doesn't. There are many different types of spoiler candidates, and different voting methods have varying levels of immunity to them. For example, instant runoff voting is immune to a type of spoiler called a clone. On the other hand, plurality is incredibly susceptible to that type of spoiler candidate. So while a method may be generally not immune to spoilers, how susceptible it is to them can be widely varied. One might ask whether there is a single voting method that satisfies every fairness criterion. And indeed, mathematicians, economists, philosophers, and social scientists have worked hard to try to find such a result. And it has resulted in what I think are the two most unfortunate theorems in mathematics. These are Arrow's impossibility theorem and the gibbard-satterthwaite theorem. Kenneth Arrow proved his impossibility theorem in 1950. In it, he compared three fairness criteria. The first is the no dictator criterion, which says that no one voter can have the power to determine the election unilaterally. The second is Pareto efficiency, which says that if the entire electorate indicates that they preferred candidate A to candidate B, then the election method cannot indicate that candidate B was collectively preferred to candidate A. As you might expect, practically every reasonable voting method satisfies both these criteria, and certainly every method that we've mentioned in this video so far satisfies them. The third criterion is independence of irrelevant alternatives. Arrow proved that no ranked choice voting method in an election for three or more candidates can satisfy all three of these criteria simultaneously. Since practically all ranked choice voting methods satisfy no dictators and Pareto efficiency, effectively what this theorem says is that all ranked choice voting methods are susceptible to spoiler candidates of some kind, which is pretty unfortunate. Perhaps equally, if not more unfortunate, is the gibbard-satterthwaite theorem. This was proved independently by Alan Gibbard in 1973 and Mark Satterthwaite in 1975. This theorem also compares a handful of fairness criteria. The first criterion is unanimity, which says that if the entire electorate lists candidate A as their first choice, then candidate A wins. Second is Pareto efficiency, which we already described. And the third criterion is the strategy proof criterion, which states that every voter obtains the best outcome by submitting an honest ballot. That is, no voter can obtain a better outcome by voting strategically. The last criterion is the no dictator criterion, which we also already described. Then the gibbard-satterthwaite theorem states that for any ranked choice voting method in an election of three or more candidates, where every voter fills out a complete ranking, if the method satisfies unanimity, Pareto efficiency, and is strategy proof, then the method has to have a dictator. Since practically all ranked choice voting methods are unanimous, Pareto efficient, and have no dictators, this theorem effectively says that all ranked choice voting methods are susceptible to strategic voting of some kind. These two theorems essentially say that no ranked choice voting method can perfectly satisfy the purpose of voting while avoiding incentivizing strategic voting. It's important to note too, though, that while these theorems don't apply to non-ranked choice voting methods like approval voting or score voting, those election methods tend to also be susceptible to strategic voting and certainly don't satisfy all the fairness criteria either. Ultimately then, there is no perfect choice. So really, in our quest to satisfy the purpose of voting while incentivizing honest voting over strategic voting, what we really need to look for is the method that gets us closest. So which of the methods that we talked about is best? Well, here's a table with 7 different fairness criteria listed, and all 5 of the voting methods we discussed, including score voting, which we didn't really give an example of. In the table, we indicate with a check mark the methods that satisfy that fairness criteria, and indicate with an X the ones that don't. The asterisks on some of the X's indicate that there is more to say there and that the methods can be shown to satisfy either a weaker version of that criteria or satisfy the criteria itself under some assumptions about voter behavior, which tend to not be realistic assumptions. There is a more complete table considering more criteria and more voting methods on Wikipedia. As you can see, the voting method that fares best is ranked pairs, and this is true even in the more complete table on Wikipedia. As an interesting note from this table, most of the political debate about which method to use centers around plurality and instant runoff voting. But those two methods are kind of the worst two possible methods to use. Though it is true that between the two, instant runoff is the better method mathematically, and supporting it has the added advantage that it keeps this conversation going. Borda count, which is another popular method, is not really that much better either. In my opinion, ranked pairs is far and away the best possible voting method currently known. And in the absence of a perfect one, we would be best off using this method over any other method currently in the public discussion. Thus, any movement towards this method should be encouraged, and for the time being, that may even mean supporting an ultimately inferior method like instant runoff voting. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this exploration into various voting methods. There is certainly much more that could be said about this topic. Indicate in the comments if you'd be interested in more videos on this, as I have several potential ones in mind. In the meantime, please like this video and subscribe to Scholar Sauce. Your support is greatly appreciated, and there's no way that it can continue to make content without it. We are really close to 1,000 subscribers, so please tell your friends about us. Also check out our other incredible content, including my reaction to Alan Becker's excellent video, Animation versus Geometry, and this awesome video about how mathematical induction can play tricks on your brain. Well, we'll see you next time on Scholar Sauce.